All right, well, since the beginning of our campaign, Scott and I have always talked about we are going to drive conversations and bring real solutions to the problems that plague government and our state. And Scott and I come from the private sector. We're not institutionalized into a bureaucratic way of thinking, if you will. And fraud is crime. You know, Scott and I, we have put out real solutions. We've put out plans on energy. We've put out plans on how to restore excellence in our education system, on how to fight inflation. What's the one I'm forgetting?
Well, we've had the energy,
inflation.
fitness, inflation, crime, personal fitness.
Yeah, a lot. We've released a lot. People can't say that we haven't put our solutions out there, whether you agree with them or not. Well, fraud is crime. And we talk about crime, we've talked about prevention, enforcement, and rehabilitation. We're not interested in just doing a post-mortem of the Feeding Our Future scandal and beating the dead horse and saying this is what happened over and over and over again. We're interested in looking at it, seeing how can we prevent this in the future? How can we enforce the laws that we have in place right now to make sure people are brought to justice? And then how can we rehab this system? Because this is not a one-off. This, once again, is Minnesota making national headlines for the wrong reasons. How do we fix the systemic fraud, waste, and abuse that's going on in our system? That's what we're here to do. And this should be concerned, this should be one of those things that falls outside the realm of partisan politics. This should concern all Minnesotans, because every single year, billions of dollars, billions of taxpayer dollars are being lost to fraud, waste, and abuse, and it needs to be fixed.
I think perhaps one of the programs that we might highlight, Matt, would be the Protecting Women. And I think that we went out and tried to get in front of that issue and try to make sure that there's things we can do together. Thanks for being here. I think that over the last 10 days there's been a broad discussion. Over the last 72 hours I've been contacted by hundreds of Minnesotans by text, phone, email, and in person. And what I'm hearing is, so the response that we've gotten from Keith Ellison and Tim Walz is to blame the judge for his ruling, even though the judge never ruled on any payments. To blame the Department of Agriculture for the clumsy setup of the program. To blame, if you will, not just the judge, not just the Department of Agriculture, but then to go ahead and blame others. And we're seeing that. I think we saw that the Department of Education is trying to deflect their responsibility. But the bottom line is, there's no one to blame here other than the Department of Education, Tim Walz, and the Attorney General. You can blame them, Feeding Our Futures, for doing the scandal, if you will, and the abuse. But at the end of the day, this did not work. Keith Ellison can come out and say, our system worked. We detected the problem. But that's not what happened. $250 million was stolen. If you lose a football game on a Sunday and you come up with a perfect game plan whereby you could have won that game 3 days later, that doesn't mean a whole lot. So what we're saying today is that we need to get in front of this. We suggested that a special investigation take place so that we audit what exactly happened, so that we're not seeing the governor blame the judge or blame the FBI or blame the Department of Agriculture. But instead, let's get in front of this. So what does that mean? Well, we've done a lot of digging. We've looked at a variety of programs put in place in other states as well as in the private sector. And we think there's a way that we can help Minnesota government be better, be more nimble, be more responsive. Right now, if you add up and divide, so add up the total number of dollars lost by scandal, waste, fraud, abuse, cost overruns, embezzlement, a variety of things. If you add up what we lost in the daycare fraud, and you probably remember that situation through the Department of Human Services, where the Inspector General to the DHS was held responsible at some level for the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars were absconded. And she ended up being transferred to another department. Her $130,000 salary was maintained, and there was no disciplinary action. Matt's right. This isn't a one-off situation. What we're seeing is a pattern. We're seeing a pattern over and over again. How do other states deal with this? How does the private sector deal with this? This is what we're proposing today. We still believe that Heather Mueller should step down as Commissioner of Education. She did not do her job. She did not do due diligence. She did not go out and do the work that she could have done. We still believe that the buck stops at the desk of Tim Walz. There is no question about that. And when I listened to a radio interview the other night with Attorney General Keith Ellison, I was astonished to hear him say over and over again, our system worked. We detected it and we turned it over to the FBI. No, he lost $250 million. Here's what we need to do going into the future. And this is what we will do on day one when I'm governor. We will appoint an independent and nonpartisan Inspector General for state spending. Right now, we have an Inspector General for the Department of Human Services, but that's it. Many states we looked at as models, Massachusetts, Florida, have Inspector Generals. What do Inspector Generals generally do? What is their mission, their job? It's to serve as an independent agency, apart from either party, that prevents and detects fraud, waste and abuse of public funds and public property, and promotes transparency and efficiency in government. We serve the residents of Massachusetts in this situation, state and local governments, and those who work with the government. Right now, it seems that in Minnesota, we're getting this he said, she said kind of thing. And that's not what this is. This is raw, horrific fraud whereby money that was supposed to be targeted to kids in need, to kids that were food insecure, didn't happen. $250 million at least is gone. The amount of that will be recovered is probably going to be painfully and woefully small. So we need an Inspector General for state spending. We can do that. We can do that on day one. We'll post the job. And in the first month, we'll try to find that person, and we'll try to find the best person we can. And that person will indeed function independently. The second thing we need to do in this state is we need to strengthen the whistleblower protections, because we need people coming forward. Over the last few days, I've had people call me. Sometimes people who are state government employees, sometimes people who are outside the state government employee body. They're calling saying, you know, we knew there was something going on. We reported this up. We reported this long before anything happened. It is interesting that both Tim Walz and Keith Ellison have been very hesitant to provide any specific dates. When did they contact the FBI? When did they do this? When they notified the court that all their concerns regarding the Feeding Our Future program had been resolved and everything was good to go? When was that? Give us specifics. Because to the reader of the Star Tribune's timeline yesterday, it looks like there were only rulings made in December of 2020 and a ruling made in June of 2021. And neither of those rulings had anything to do with making payments from the Department of Education to Feeding Our Futures. So we need to strengthen the whistleblower protections. That will allow us to get at embezzlement, to get at waste and fraud quicker. We need to be more nimble as a government. Third, we need to utilize tools to flag fraud that are being used both in other states as well as the private sector. What do I mean by that? Well, an example would be a company called LexisNexis, and you might have heard of it. And what they do is they help crack down on identity fraud. How does identity fraud contribute to the fraud of spending in regards to the state of Minnesota? Well, identity fraud can do a variety of things, but certainly in terms of accessing programs is one of the big abuses. I served one term in the Senate, and we definitely saw this in terms of being able to get on programs that you may not have been entitled to. Identity fraud was a big deal. Duplication of individuals on, if you will, on medical assistance oftentimes happen where literally 2 or 3 different insurance companies could be paid for, could be paying, if you will, could be paid for taking care of that same patient. We need to deduplicate, and that was also part of it. But LexisNexis specifically identifies fraud online. They identify fraud in a way that they can prevent it from happening. They integrate external data sets. They basically create a model. They try to create sort of a pattern. And they'll say something like, well, this 45-year-old male, if you see this, this, and this, that would flag that there may be a problem. This is what needs to happen. They also have the ability to provide some advanced program integrity for the state of Minnesota. And if you remember how we struggled with our in-laws and things like that, that would be problematic as well. You might also remember that we had millions of dollars did not go to the targeted pool of homeless people the housing that could have taken place with that initiative did not happen. We saw the daycare, we saw the homeless. Recently, we saw the Department of Health not get really a clean bill of health. The concern was on the audit that there hadn't been adequate actions and diligence taken to make certain that any conflicts of interest and things like that would be avoided. All of these things, I think, could be corrected by having a more robust program of tools to use in Minnesota for preventing fraud. The other thing that we would see, I think, with using tools in regards to other states is we need to share data with other states. If we have programs that definitely call for a direct payment or a direct expense in relation to an individual, it may well be that multi-state sharing might be something we have to look at. Whether, again, it be daycare and someone not being disciplined, whether it be the homeless, whether it be the way grants were provided without adequate protections, or now feeding our children. These are the things that we need to get in front of. And right now, we're not getting a lot of straight talk. We're not getting timelines. I know that many FOIA requests have been submitted for email so that we can understand more completely what happened. And I think a special investigation would solve that, provide that. But I think we need to get in front of that, and that's what we're trying to say today, is there's a way for us to, if you will, get in front of this, indeed prevent this from happening, enforce the operational policies that we have in place, and ultimately allow us to rehab our various departments so that they can do a better job serving Minnesota. There'll be a variety of sources that you can look, but if we could just turn our attention to these pictures. I think the first one you'll see is Owatonna. How many meals is that, Matt?
2,000.
So all that would have needed to happen was someone go and watch this site for 2 or 3 hours and see if from this place it would be likely to see 2,000 meals distributed daily. Let's do another one. I think this is Minneapolis, isn't it?
This is,
Yes.
So, and how many meals?
2,600.
So 2,600 meals a day out of this storefront, this edifice?
Yep.
How long would it take for a person to monitor that? I mean, we had Keith Ellison going out and sending some of his staff to monitor mom and pop small restaurants that were trying to serve a waffle or two to try to keep the bills paid, and yet we didn't have the ability to do this. What was the next one? I think that was outstanding, if I remember right.
8,000. Minneapolis.
I ran the math. If you're going to try to do 6,000 meals in a 10-hour period, literally, you're doing multiple meals per minute. 8,000, if you were going to try to serve hungry kids this food between the hours of, say, 7 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that would be 7 hours. You're talking about more than 1,000 meals per hour. There's 60 minutes in an hour. Divide 60 minutes by 1,000, and you can imagine what kind of bedlam you would have if you were truly serving this kind of meal. What would it have taken for us to not lose 250 million, but maybe really catch this, if you will, at the nidus of the problem, and maybe we would have only lost $10 million. But the bottom line is, when Keith Ellison and Tim Walz tell Minnesota that our operational policies worked, we identified the problem, we turned it over to the FBI, and the FBI shackled our hands and told us that we had to keep making fraudulent payments so that their investigation wouldn't be impeded. Frankly, Minnesotans are way too smart for that. They're not buying what this administration is selling. All that we needed to do was simply do a drive-by inspection and watch for a couple of hours. I believe one feeding site sponsored by Feeding Our Future was a 3rd floor apartment in an apartment complex. Think about that. 3rd floor apartment in an apartment complex. Hundreds or thousands of meals served from that apartment door. As you well know, in apartments, generally there's a door in and there's a door out. Hundreds of thousands of meals served there. I think what we have seen is woeful disregard for responsibly stewarding state dollars. And I think Minnesotans have every right to be upset. When you tally the cost, and when you add in the cost of the overrun from the Southwest Light Rail and put that into the combination, and then you divide that by the households in Minnesota, you literally get to $1,000 plus per typical household in Minnesota this year. This is crazy. Minnesotans expect good government, and they expect their hard-earned dollars to be used for the good. not for the fraud. So that's why we're speaking to you today. To summarize, we think without question, Minnesota needs a statewide inspector general that functions independently of the governor's office as well as of the legislature. We also think that we need to protect our whistleblowers so they'll come forward with more courage, not feeling like they're putting their job in jeopardy. And thirdly, we need to use some of the tools that are being used in the private sector as well as in other states to identify so that we can indeed prevent as well as enforce our operational policies so that they work, and we can rehab the systems we have in place so that this never happens again. But I hope that Minnesotans realize that they have been supremely insulted when you have the governor of state and the attorney general telling you that the system worked, and it might have worked even better if it hadn't been for the erroneous judge, the demanding FBI, and the fumbling Department of Agriculture. I don't think Minnesotans are buying what these two men are selling. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Can you talk a little bit more about this independent inspector general and the process for appointing that person?
What we'd have to do is the governor could create such a position. This has happened before. I think we have an equity person right now that's been created. But then the governor would have to go to the legislature and try to get that made into a permanent position. And that, I think, that person would probably end up establishing a fairly good relationship, I would hope, with the Office of Legislative Audits. But if you look at what the numerous states have done, Florida has an Office of Chief, an Inspector General, and they have an Office of the Chief, but they also have Inspector Generals for Healthcare Administration, persons with disabilities, agriculture, and mechanical university. You probably know that we do have one Inspector General in the Minnesota program, and that's for DHS. And that was, I think you saw, that was created, I think she is a person I'm thinking of, but obviously it's a non-gender position. But I think that position was created in 2011. And so we've had it for about 11 years, and clearly in the daycare fraud, there was serious concerns about whether or not that person had been doing their job, and so they were transferred to another department, but they were never disciplined, and that was after about 10 months of Governor Walz being the governor.
So assuming that you were elected, would it be up to you to decide who that person is? And how do you pick that person and assure Minnesotans that they're not a partisan appointment?
I think what we probably have to do is we probably have to say, how can we do this in a nonpartisan way? I think the first thing we do is post the position and then perhaps go to the majority and minority leaders in both chambers and say, okay, let's together identify who we could do and then put that in place. I'm not interested in making this, if you will, some political ally of mine as governor. I would like to see this person be able to really function independently. We've seen this happen at the federal level where frequently there'll be a special investigator or a special prosecutor. But if you don't do it right at the front end, if you don't do it in a way that is not partisan, that person's not partisan, then you're not accomplishing anything. I would say the same thing about a lot of appointments from the governor's perspective. I think we have too many appointments made to too many boards and to too many, even the medical practice board. I think we've over-politicized some of that with the way we do these appointments. We need to somehow get away from the partisan appointment process. Other questions?
What kind of qualifications or background would you hope this person might?
Well, I think that I did read off a few of the top things that you look for in an inspector general. Certainly you'd want someone with the familiarity with state law. You'd want someone, would this have to be an attorney? Absolutely not. But I think private sector people that are perhaps work in operations, perhaps in finance. But the Massachusetts situation, what they looked at was they really wanted someone that could prevent and detect fraud, waste, and abuse of public funds and public property, promoting transparency and efficiency. So I think that you're looking at someone who's probably familiar with for-profit and non-profit businesses. But I think the devil's in the details, so I appreciate your question. But this would be something that literally we could put meat on the bones and flush this out a little bit from perhaps November 9th to December 5th or 15th or somewhere in there. Get it ready and then post it on the first day that I'm governor and try to fill that spot in the first month and do it in a nonpartisan way. And I'm confident that we can do that.
Do you think they need to have a staff to, help survey all of government? I mean, would one person be able to handle this?
I think you'd see people within each one of the departments we already have. We have those people in place. So are we going to be creating a whole behemoth layer of new government? I don't think so. I think we're talking about someone who's going to be able to function independently in a nonpartisan fashion. And I think it'll be that person that you might well create an avenue upwards from whistleblowers to this person, so that there would be someone that a whistleblower could go to and say, I have a concern. I don't want to put my job at risk. And I know that if I put this on the table at one of our weekly staff meetings, I'm going to be in hot water. If we're really serious about this and saying, let's not politicize this, then I don't think it's important for me today to give you the 10 bullet points that I'm going to look for in this position. What matters is that if you look at other states doing it with some success, I guess right now the way it would look, 49 states are more successful than us in terms of fraud, waste, and abuse prevention. So I think from that perspective, I think that Minnesota should be, if you will, open to a discussion as to how to do it better, particularly in regards to the fact that Keith Ellison and Tim Walz don't seem to want to help us understand completely what happened during feeding our future, the entire, if you will, scandal.
So in theory, this person, if they would have been in place, while this feeding our future scandal was happening, they would have been doing some sort of regular routine checks on all these different agencies and money coming in and out, and could have, through maybe some software that you mentioned, had caught this?
There is no question in my mind that if we had an inspector general that operated independently, that this would not have happened to the tune of $250 million. No question in my mind. I think this person would have been going to Keith Ellison and Tim Walz saying, we've got a major problem, and we need to sue feeding our future. We need to play offense, not just be on our heels playing defense. Over and over again, we saw the Department of Education and the state of Minnesota fold like a sloppy folding chair, or a poor suit, or whatever that cliche is. This is crazy. We lost $250 million, and we can't house our veterans. Every Minnesotan should be offended at this. And when Keith Ellison stands there and says that the system succeeded, that we identified it, my stars, if success means $250 million every time, what kind of nutcase is that?
Can I say one thing?
Yeah, please.
With this scandal specifically, Barney Fife could have caught this fraud. We're talking about a third-floor apartment being approved as a feeding site. We're talking about submission of invoices where it's exactly 2,600 meals a day, every single day for weeks on end. This is fraud on its face. You don't need some highly qualified inspector general to catch this fraud specifically. Obviously, there are a lot more that are a little bit more complicated than this, but these were not criminal masterminds. They took advantage of a very, very broken system.
How important is this issue to voters, and is this the biggest thing that's going to be weighing on their mind going into November?
I think it's important to voters because I think that what they're concerned about is that we're seeing not just a one-off situation. You can say maybe one-off with Minlars. You can say maybe one-off if it was just daycare. But when they just keep at it, we've got half a dozen, and we haven't even talked about buying a $7 million building for a morgue that was never needed, never saw a cadaver, and ended up being sold at a net loss of $1 million. I think Minnesotans are saying, what in the world's going on? We want open, transparent leadership. We've got a governor who's hunkering down in the basement, not willing to do debates, not willing to meet with the press, canceling his events on Tuesday nights in Hutchinson because he doesn't want to answer these tough questions from you folks. I think Minnesotans are saying, this is crazy. And so I think this is extremely concerning. Is it to the level of our deep concerns about the lawlessness on the streets and the inflationary policies that have put in place and what we've done to our children and education? That'll be up for the voters to decide. But I don't think there's any question that what we're seeing emerge over these last 6 weeks of the election cycle will be what kind of leadership are we getting?
Sort of on that same note, how are you feeling going into the last 6 weeks of the election, and do you feel confident with the campaign cash that you have?
I feel that there's an energy going across Minnesota that's providing for a level of engagement that, in my limited political exposure, is something I've never seen before. I think both Matt Burke and I are gratified by that electrical energy out there that feeds us to work harder and to get to more places. But I think Matt Burke and I are we're going to work our tail off, and we're very confident that regardless of what happens in the election, we've been deeply blessed at all levels, and we would like the opportunity to serve Minnesota as governor and lieutenant governor, and we're feeling very good. Out fundraising Tim Walz in the period of time over the last 2 months is a real win for us. We're seeing conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans donating to our campaign. That's huge. We've set records for a Republican gubernatorial candidate We have over 100,000 people on our email team. We have 35,000 unique donations. We have a social media presence that is exceeded by no one. No one gets close to us. So we feel good about it. But most importantly, we feel like Minnesotans are engaged, and that bodes well for us. Thank you. Thank you very much, folks. Appreciate it.
Thanks.